As Steve was saying in recounting my biography, I'm wearing a number of different hats these days, and I wanted to say just a little bit about the last one, about the teaching part. Because I had a revelation a few years ago. This is after many, many years of giving literally thousands of presentations to students, to corporate executives, testifying before the U.S. Congress, and talking to audiences all over the world. And I finally had the realization that many of the ideas, many of the recommendations, many of the concepts that I was trying to convey weren't being fully comprehended by my audiences. And the reason for that was that I, as well as many other water professionals, I think we take too much for granted. We make an assumption that the general public knows more about water than actually some of the market research suggests. A few years ago, my organization, the Nature Conservancy, conducted a market research poll of Americans, and we were a bit dismayed to find out that 77% of Americans have absolutely no idea where their water comes from. They can't say more than it comes out of the tap or it comes out of the shower. They couldn't name the river, they couldn't name the underground aquifer, the lake that their water comes from. And so this revelation left a very big impression on me, and it made me understand that if I was going to continue to try to share what I know about water, that I was going to have to be a little bit more careful with some of the terminology and some of the assumptions about the level at which I'm talking to my audiences. Now, so if at times during this presentation you feel like I'm talking like a school teacher, that's the reason why, is that I'm just trying to make sure that everybody understands the concepts and where I'm coming from and the assumptions that I'm making. And so I'm going to build this understanding literally from the ground up. I'm going to start with the basic foundations of water. And today, of course, I'm going to be speaking specifically about the quantity of water that is available to us or not available to us, and some of the issues, challenges, and problems that that's creating in the world. So here's what we're going to cover today. I'm first going to try to answer the question of, are we running out of water? And then I will, spoiler alert here, I am going to conclude that yes, there are parts of the world that are running out of water. So I want to address, how did we get into this mess? Why are we running out of water? And then starting to switch to solutions, I want to say a little bit about why business as usual isn't going to work, at least not going to work as well in the 21st century as it did in the 20th century. And then I'm going to really hone in on a handful of strategies, a handful of solutions that are being demonstrated, put into place to very, very good effect, both in cities and farms around the world. And I'll conclude with some ideas about what our future might look like in a water-secure future. So the first question, are we running out of water? Well, this is one of the most common questions that I get asked in all of my presentations. And I get asked because many of us, nearly all of us, were taught in grade school that there is this global water cycle, that water is constantly moving through the atmosphere and raining down on the land, and that water's moving across the land and beneath the soil, underground, and there's this great circulation system that we call the global water cycle, powered, of course, by solar energy. And so the follow-up question that I typically get is, how could we be running out of water? Don't we have the same amount of water on our planet as we've always had? And the basic answer is yes, that's true. But in the global hydrologic cycle, the water evaporates off the ocean. A very, very large amount of fresh water is produced simply by that solar process, that solar energy. Condenses into clouds. The clouds are carried by wind over the landscape. It rains or snows on the land. And then it travels over the land. Some of it will travel through the ground and get into underground aquifers. Some of it will travel over the surface and gather into rivers, into lakes. Some of it gets stalled out for a little while. Some of it will get stuck in a lake for a little while, stored in a lake for a while. Some of it will end up in groundwater aquifers and basically get stuck there for a while. But what I'm really talking about here today is the water that's moving through that global water cycle. And so how is it exactly that we could be running out of water given that we do have the same amount, the same volume, traveling through this global water cycle on our planet? This is a little bit of a different portrayal of the global water cycle. And don't worry about, there are some numbers on here. You don't need to pay any attention to those. Instead, the relative size of the bands of these big arrows is what I want you to pay attention to. And so this is a representation of what the global annual water cycle would look like if we human beings were not having any influence on it. And so of all that rainfall that comes down out of the sky, about close to 60%, close to 2/3 of it, hits the land surface and is immediately taken up by plants, taken up by vegetation, grasses, trees, wetlands, and that sort of thing. And then almost immediately after the plants use that water, it goes back up into the sky, it evaporates out of the plants, it transpires out of the plants, and goes back up in the atmosphere. And so it's kind of a short loop in the global water cycle that way. About 25% of the water that falls out of the sky ends up gathering and collecting in rivers, and some smaller portion of it then ends up percolating through the soil and getting into groundwater aquifers. That's the basic budget. That's the basic global water account represented here. Now I'm going to start to add in a little bit of the human influences, and we'll see how big of an effect they are having. This thin band is the portion of the rainfall that we essentially put to work in rain-fed agriculture. This is a portion of our crop production that uses purely rain. It's not irrigated with supplemental water. It's just grown on rain alone. This accounts for about 60% of all the crop production on the planet, and it's about 80% of the land that's being used for agricultural purposes. But as you can see by the width of this stripe, it's a pretty small number. So it's only about 5% of all that water that falls out of the sky is getting put to purpose in rain-fed agriculture. Now we can add on to that all of the other uses of water that we tap into for all of the human enterprise. We take water out of flowing rivers, we take water out of lakes, we take water out of the underground, out of groundwater aquifers, and we use it for all kinds of things. We use it in our cities, we use it in our industries, we use it to grow food when it requires supplemental irrigation. But again, you see the width of the band here. It's only adding another 4% of water use. So in total, only about 9% of the water falling out of the sky onto the land surface of our planet is being appropriated or utilized in some way for the human enterprise. Now, as you can see, all of that water that's put to use, whether it's flowing naturally and unobstructed in our rivers, or whether we're putting it to use for a while and then releasing it back into rivers or back into the sky, much of that water then flows out to our coastal areas, and about 1/3 of all that water then that comes out of the sky ends up flowing across the landscape and through the ground and ends up back into our oceans, and thereby completing that global water cycle. But again, you would say, 9%? Are you kidding me? How can we possibly have a water crisis? We're only appropriating 9% of all the available water. Things should be fine, right? And so this is the part that a lot of people don't understand about water scarcity and water shortages and how they emerge. Well, the explanation here is that although we aren't using much of the global water cycle, the problem is that we can't utilize all the water falling anywhere on the planet. And so in other words, if we're having a water shortage in the southwestern part of the United States, we can't readily, affordably tap into the Congo River over in Africa to supplement our water supplies. Okay? Technically, we could do it, yes. We could put it on tanker ships, we could run it across the land in rail cars, and we could get it to the southwestern United States. Technically, we can do it. Economically, it's impossible. It is not affordable to do that, given the expense that requires, and given the affordability, from our incomes and from the uses that we're putting the water to. So instead, we're relying upon our local water sources. We're relying upon the water that we can get to physically, technically, and affordably. So what that means is when the water comes out of the sky and it gathers in these local areas that we call watersheds. Water running off the landscape. Any of the water that runs off the landscape and ends up in the same place, the same river, is that river's watershed. And the same thing could be said for lakes. Lakes have watersheds. Even groundwater aquifers could be thought of as having a watershed. We refer to it as a recharge area, but it's basically the same concept. So the water falling out of the sky gathers into these local areas, into these local rivers, into these local lakes, and those become our water sources. Those become our water accounts. Those become the buckets of water that we tap into for our water supplies. Here's a picture of a groundwater aquifer, same basic concepts. The water falls out of the sky, it hits the land surface, some of that percolates or infiltrates into the soil, and some of it goes down deep enough and gets into the underground areas and gathers in a big underground reservoir pool that we call an aquifer. Okay? So those are our three primary types of water sources: rivers, lakes, and aquifers. Those are the things that we rely upon for so much of the water that we utilize in our daily lives. I'm going to walk you through one more cartoon, if you will, because there's a couple of concepts embedded in here that will help you to understand why we run short of water, why we're depleting our rivers, why we're depleting our aquifers, and I do that pictorially here. This you could think of as the water budget for any one of those water sources, for a local river, a local groundwater aquifer. So all of the natural replenishment of any water source on the planet, any freshwater source on the planet, comes out of the sky as rain or snow. That's the entirety of our natural water supply. Once it gets into a local water source, then we extract it. A term of art in the water community is a withdrawal. We withdraw the water out of that water source. Then, of course, we put it to some sort of use. But then much of that water that we've used ends up being returned back to the original source after we've used it. I think the easiest way to think about this, at least for me, is to think about when I take a shower. I might be using 20 gallons of water. Actually, I don't, but on average, we use about 20 gallons of water in a shower. Almost all of that water, where's it go? It goes back into the drain. It goes back down into the drain, and then in most parts of the world, it ends up going to a treatment plant, an industrial-like plant that cleans the water again after we've used it, but then releases that water back into the original place that it came from. And so we're basically a big, giant water circulation machine, at least for much of our uses. In cities, on average, about 95 to 98% of the water that we use in our homes or inside our businesses gets recirculated in this way. It does not deplete the local water budget because it gets redeposited in the water account. It gets returned to the river, gets returned to the lake in some cases. That's not true in all places, but for the most part, this concept of the returned water or return flow is very important to understanding the water budget or the water account and understanding how you can dry up a river. The part that doesn't get returned back to the original source we refer to as a consumptive loss or depletion of the water source. So let's go back to the shower. When I take a shower, some portion of it is evaporating as steam, particularly if it's a particularly hot shower. Some of it ends up on my towel after I've dried off. But again, the vast majority went down the drain, gets returned to the original source. But some portion of it is lost, and we call that consumption. We've consumed the water. It's no longer available in the local water account. As far as our local water accounting to that river that we took the water from, it's gone now, okay? And that river is waiting for the next clouds to come by and the next rainfall to replenish that water that's lost. Now, I mentioned that rain and snow, of course, is our natural water supply, but there are a couple of other ways that we can supplement or bolster our local water account. We can bring in water from other places. We can stick a big straw, a pipe, or a canal into somebody else's watershed, into somebody else's aquifer, and import that water, bring that water in, transfer that water into our local account, and it's a new deposit in our local water account. We can also do things using technology like desalination, which means taking the salt out of salty water. Desalting. This is used most commonly with ocean water, and particularly for cities that are located along coastal areas. We take the water out of the ocean, we run it through this technological process called desalination, and we end up making fresh water out of it. For every gallon that we take out of the ocean, we end up producing about a half a gallon of fresh water. The other half is a very concentrated salty brine that we have to dispose of, and hopefully dispose of in an environmentally safe way. Okay, so that's our basic water budget. Now, we get into trouble when that consumptive loss, the depletion of water, begins to approach or exceed the replenishment. Whether the replenishment is natural or coming in from some other place, it's just a simple supply and demand equation. When in my book and in my teaching with my students at the university, I say, think about this like your personal bank account. If your withdrawals from your bank account, I shouldn't use that term here. If your extractions from your bank account get to the point where they're becoming as large as your deposits or exceeding your deposits, what happens? You become bankrupt. You run out of the funds that are in your account. It's the same is true here with our water accounts. And so this is how we can dry up a river. If our consumptive use is as great as the rate of replenishment, we dry up the river. If our consumptive use of groundwater, of underground water, gets to be as high as or higher than its natural rate of replenishment, the level in the aquifer begins to decline. The water level underground begins to drop, and eventually it drops to a point where we can no longer access it, or at least access it in an affordable way. Now, when we think about that water budget, we also want to be careful to think about how much do we need to leave alone? How much water do we need to leave in the natural ecosystems? Because there are many, many benefits that are being provided by leaving some water alone. Leaving water to flow down the river. It provides habitat for fish. Turns out fish can't live without water, as evidenced by this picture. Still can't, even with genetic engineering. Fish are still dependent upon water. But there's much, much other life, of course, associated with flowing waters and with still waters like lakes. And we derive a lot of benefits, whether it's just for recreation, whether it's for wildlife viewing, whether it's bird watching, or whether it's because we depend upon these fisheries. And these fisheries are part of our food supply, part of our food security. This reminds me of a few years ago, my father and I were having a conversation. My father lives in San Diego, and he said, Brian, I think we could solve our water problems here in Southern California if we could just capture more of that water that's running off to the sea and being wasted out in the sea. And I had to explain to him that in fact that water that stays in the natural environment and runs out to the coast is providing some really important services. I just mentioned some of them, but one of them is once the water in the river gets out to the ocean, it mixes with salt water in these areas that we call estuaries and forms these magical places that are the most biologically productive ecosystems on our planet. It's where much of our fish and shellfish populations are grown there or born there. So we have to pay attention when we're thinking about our water budgets. We got to think about the question of how much water does the river need? How much water does the estuary need in order to maintain these other values and benefits that our society derives from them? I'm not sure. Sorry about that. Not sure why that got hung up. All right. Back on track. So That's the simplest possible way that I can describe to you what a water budget, what a water account is, and that's the simplest way that I can explain to you how we end up getting into trouble, how we end up drying up our rivers and our groundwater aquifers. Now, there are groups of scientists around the world, primarily working in various academic institutions, that are keeping track of that water budget for all of the water sources on our planet, keeping track of what's going on with each river, each lake, each groundwater aquifer, and making more increasingly accurate estimates of those different parts of the water budget that I just shared with you. And what we're finding is a bit disturbing. As you can see from the red and the yellow zones that are on this map, about a third of all of the water sources on our planet are being very, very heavily utilized to the point of being exhausted. That there is no buffer left. We are up against the limits of the available water supply. There's not much more that we can take out of them. And you can see that they're literally distributed around the world. And some of the interesting things that we have found is that this problem is not restricted to arid or semi-arid zones. It's not in the dry areas of the world alone. Those places do have less replenishment, less water supply available. But even in the humid areas, we're seeing places like the city of Sao Paulo in Brazil, some of the other big cities of the planet where, because the rate of use, the consumptive use of the water got to be so high, and particularly during a particularly dry period, such as a drought, that they ran into trouble, they ran out of water, and they had a water shortage with catastrophic consequences. So these things can happen even in some of the wetter parts of our planet. Now, so that's about a third of all the places, but disturbingly, it's affecting about a half of the global population. And even more worrisome is the fact that it's affecting about 3/4 of all the places where we're practicing irrigated agriculture presently. So again, irrigated agriculture accounts for only about 20% of all the agricultural lands, but it's about 40% of our food production. So of that 40% of our food production, about 3/4 of that, so something on the order of 30% of all of our food production is taking place in these places where they're running out of water, where they're up against the limits of their available water supply. Now, the consequences of that are showing up in some very, very different ways. The picture on the left is a picture of Texas back in 2011, when the farmers there didn't have enough water to adequately irrigate a lot of their crops. They had massive crop failures in the state, and they lost a lot of money. Estimated at about $8 billion of agricultural revenue was lost in one single year, in the year 2011 in Texas. But those sorts of food shortages are happening in a lot of places around the world because of not having enough water to be able to grow the crops. It also affects our electricity supply. So when we're producing electricity using a power plant, a coal-fired power plant, an oil or gas power plant, a nuclear power plant, we have to run water, circulate water through those plants, or else they'd literally burn up. And so we use that water to cool them, keep them cool, so they can keep producing electricity. If we don't have enough water available, then you can't produce that electricity. And we've seen many, many power plants having to be shut down. The picture in the center here is of a dam, a hydroelectric power dam, which uses stored water behind the dam to generate electricity. If you don't have enough water behind the dam, as the lake level starts to drop, it has a very marked effect on the amount of electricity that you can produce. So one of our big concerns right now in the southwestern part of the United States is that these big reservoirs on the Colorado River system, for example, like at Lake Mead or upstream at Lake Powell, that those reservoirs are dropping in their water levels, and it's going to start affecting how much electricity they can produce, which then has ramifications throughout the southwestern United States, because these are really important to our electricity supply, to our energy security. And then I mentioned the picture on the right again, that we're seeing dire consequences for freshwater life, for aquatic life. As we take too much water out of their natural habitats, we're seeing fish kills, we're seeing species entirely disappear from rivers. If you keep drying them up, even if it's only momentarily, if you recurringly keep drying them up, a lot of species are no longer going to be able to persist and exist there. with my students at the University of Virginia, we've collected a lot of information about these water shortage events, these impacts that happen when we run short on water. And so we've documented hundreds of places over the last decade or two all around the world and started to try to see whether or not there was a relationship between the water budget, how much the water was being depleted, and the likelihood of these water shortage events occurring. Now, intuitively, you'd say, of course. You know, if you've gotten to be so dependent to a high degree on using all of the water available, then of course you might go into a drier period and you're going to have a water shortage. And so our statistical analysis have proven that to be true. The heavier you're utilizing the available water supply, the heavier you're consuming that water, the much greater are your chances that you're going to experience water shortages either on a once-in-a-while basis or on a frequent basis or on a continual basis. And we've looked at the same thing for fish and other animals and plants that live in these freshwater systems, and it turns out that they're even more vulnerable, that you don't have to remove a whole lot of water too many times out of a river or out of a lake, and you start to have really serious consequences for the aquatic life in those freshwater systems. So let me turn now to how did we get into this mess? How did we let this happen? Shouldn't we have seen this coming from a long time ago? And the answer is yes, we should have seen this coming. And hopefully we'll get better at being able to see when we're about to drive off a cliff with our water accounts in the future. But these are two graphs that I wanted to share with you that show you what's happened in two different places, in different parts of the world. The upper one is from Australia. It's from a river called the Murray-Darling River Basin in southeastern Australia. The bottom one is from the Colorado River in the American West. And these pictures tell the story of what's happened in these two rivers over time. Both of them represent nearly 100 years of information. The lighter blue in the background is the amount of water moving down each of these two river systems every year over time for the last 100 years. You can see that it varies, right? It varies a great deal. From year to year, it's not the same. It's hard to even talk about an average because from year to year, you have some years you have a whole lot of water, and other years you have much less water. The darker blue trace here represents the water that we use, the water that we consumptively use, that we remove from those river systems. What you see in both of these traces is what you see in virtually all of those places that were in the hot zones around the world on the water scarcity map that I showed you a moment ago. What it shows is that over time we have allowed the water, the consumption of water to grow to the point where it literally bumps up against the ceiling of the available water supply. And to state it simply, things go really badly wrong when that happens. In the story that I just told you about all the different impacts that can result when we get into that situation. Now I say we gave away. You know, there's many of these places in the world where water is essentially a free-for-all. In fact, there are about 62 countries that are experiencing water shortages, water scarcity on a semi-regular basis. Only about half of those have any controls on water use whatsoever. It's essentially a free-for-all. It's a common pool that's being utilized without any restrictions. Nobody's telling anybody how much water they get to use or for what purpose or in what amounts. And instead, it just accumulates. With the growing population, the growing, increasing area of irrigated farmland, eventually all of the water that's available gets taken up. And we're drying up rivers. We're drying up some of the biggest rivers on the planet in that process. The Yellow River in China, the Brahmaputra River in India and Bangladesh, the Indus, the Rio Grande, the Colorado River here. We're drying up some of the biggest rivers on our planet through this process of just gradually increasing the amount of water that we're consumptively using. On the bottom, the same story for the Colorado River. Even in the half of countries that are experiencing water scarcity that have put a permitting system into place, they've put a water rights system into place that says you get to use 10 units of water to grow your crop. You get to use 20 units of water to provide water for your local community as drinking water. Even in the places that have put those kinds of rules and regulations into place, they have been unable or unwilling to put restrictions on it. So they just keep issuing more and more tickets, more and more passes, more and more water rights, to the point where you get into the same situation as if you had no controls at all. So even though they have the mechanism available to them to try to manage this and try to control this, they aren't adequately using it or they aren't adequately enforcing it. Now, another part of the story about how did we get into this mess that's important to understand is that around the world, and especially in these water-scarce regions of the world, over 90% of all of the consumptive use of water is going to irrigated agriculture. That's mind-boggling, right? I mean, when we do surveys of the general population, we ask them who's using the most water in the Colorado River, we get a very, very different response from the surveys. They all think that it's going to big cities like Denver and Los Angeles and Las Vegas. For God's sakes, look at Las Vegas. They've got all these fountains, you know, blowing all this water up in the air. They must be the big water user. Well, in fact, the reality, the factual reality is very, very different. The vast majority is going to growing our crops, our food and our crops that we use for other purposes. And I'm going to touch on this again. I'm going to revisit this here in a moment, but this is really, really important when we start to talk about solutions and strategies for trying to deal with some of these issues. Now, this is a map that we put together. It looks similar to the map that I showed, the static map that I showed you before, but you can see here that this is animated. So this is a time series that we've been able to reconstruct what the water budgets, what the water accounts were for all these different water sources all over the planet, and see how much they were being depleted going back as far as 1900, more than a century ago. The story that's really evident from this animation is that we have been heavily exhausting our water sources for a very long time. In fact, if I had information to go back to 1800 or 1700, you'd see that there were a lot of places where we were pretty much tapping out all the available water. We were drying up rivers for a very, very long time and putting them to use. And putting them to, I want to be clear, putting them arguably to very important human uses that enabled the development of our societies, that enabled the development of our civilizations and our economies. But the concern here is that once we get to exhausting those water supplies, we have other consequences to deal with, and we want to try to avoid those, right? So this shows you how that has happened. It shows you how this heavy depletion of the water has evolved, how it's spread globally over time, and how it's intensified in a lot of places, how it's gotten to be more and more of the available water being used. Okay, let's shift to solutions here. I'm always conscious of not letting everybody get too depressed, and we need to turn quickly now to talking about what can we do about this. But I'm going to start by saying that the solutions that we have been investing in the past century are not going to work as well going forward. I'm going to give you a few reasons why. So one really important strategy used all around the world historically has been to build big reservoirs. It enables us to capture some of that water, a lot of that water that was flowing down the river and flowing out to the ocean, so that we could put it to use, so that we could then divert it to our cities, to our farms, so that we could generate electricity with it. The problem going forward is that building another reservoir in a place that's already running out of water isn't going to make things any better, because reservoirs don't create water. They just stall it out for a while. They just hold on to it temporarily so that we can utilize more of it. And so if we're already using a dangerously high volume of water relative to the rate at which it's being replenished, building reservoirs isn't necessarily going to help much. They can help give us the access to water at different times of the year, or sometimes get us through a dry year and make water available in the next year. But over the long term, it doesn't make any new water. So it's not really a solution to this problem of water shortages. Another strategy that we have globally invested in very heavily is water importation, the transfer of water from one place to another. I touched on this a moment ago. One of the best, most illustrative examples of this is what's taking place in China right now. This is a picture of the South-North Water Diversion Project. It's concrete tunnels and pipes and open canals that move water thousands of kilometers from the wetter southern part of the country of China and move it to the north, up into areas where they have used up all of their available water supplies. The capital city of Beijing, for instance, used up all the local water supply. They had to find some more. The North China Plain, the breadbasket of China, where they grow the vast majority of their agricultural goods, they have so overutilized the groundwater that many of the farmers' wells can no longer get that deep to pull that water because it's gotten so deep underground. So the Chinese solution to this, at least for now, is to build this big pipeline to move water from the wet south to the drier north, where they've run out of water. This has come at an exorbitant cost. It's estimated to have spent about $80 billion to date. This is only the first of 3 phases of this diversion project. And one of the concerns is that when you do these kinds of water transfer projects, that eventually you're just robbing Peter to pay Paul. In other words, if you take too much water out of the southern part, and specifically this water is coming out of the Yangtze River Basin, and send it up to the north, then eventually you're going to have consequences for the Yangtze River itself. And so by transferring water, we have to be careful that we're not just creating or transferring problems, that we're not spreading water scarcity by robbing the places that still had a little bit of extra water and sending it to the places that have run out of water, as well as being very expensive. And also, these projects require tremendous energy. In the places in the world where you have large water transfer projects like this, they are the single largest electricity users in those places. Southern California receives a lot of water coming in to the east from the Colorado River, coming from the north in Northern California, and the electricity it takes to move the water that far has made the water agency that does that water moving the single largest consumer of electricity in California. The same is true in Arizona. They built the Central Arizona Project to pull water out of the Colorado River and move it all the way across the state through Phoenix down to Tucson. The Central Arizona Project is the single largest user of electricity in Arizona. So it's tremendously energy intensive. That could lead to other environmental problems. If the energy source is coming from energy producing mechanisms that generate a lot of carbon emissions, then we're just contributing to the problems of climate change. Okay? So this is not going to be available to us, at least not at the scale that we've utilized it previously. Another reason why we can't be moving water around is that we can't reach far enough to go find surplus water anymore. If you're embedded in one of these water scarce areas on this map, you'd have to build a very, very long pipeline in order to get to some place that had some surplus water, and you're going to have to deal with the politics of the local communities that are saying, no, you can't take our water, we're going to need that for our water future. And so it's becoming very politically contentious in addition to the cost, that's associated with it. Another strategy that has gained a lot of favor, particularly in the last couple of decades, is either recycling our water. So we use the water in the city, and instead of putting it back into the river or back into the lake, we'll just keep reusing it, and in essence requiring that we take less water out of the front end, less withdrawal, but we recycle the water, which means we have less being returned back to the system. Well, that works pretty well for cities, and it makes sense in a lot of places, but we have to be conscious of the fact that we might be stealing some of the water that would have otherwise returned back to the source by recycling that water. It can be a useful strategy in some places, though. I don't want to diminish that. Building desalination plants. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but taking the salt out of the water, the big problem there is the electricity requirements. Very, very heavy electricity requirements. It makes that water very expensive and too expensive for most uses of the water. Okay? So, for instance, we can't use it to grow lower valued crops because it simply would cause the farmer to go broke. The water's too expensive to use for that purpose. In our research, we've compiled data from a lot of different cities around the world and looked at their options for how they can rebalance their water budgets, and looked at the different strategies, many of which I've just talked about. desalting ocean water, recycling water, importing it from other places, using local sources of water. And this is a depiction of one city, the city of San Diego, as it's labeled here. And you can see from where the bars are, the graph represents the cost for each unit of water. It's here in cubic meters of water. And the numbers that are out on the far right are really expensive. So desalination and recycling tend to be on the order of maybe 10 times or more cost than some of the other options. And these are concerns because what we're finding is that in many communities, not just here in the United States, but around the world, there are some families in our communities, in our societies, that simply cannot afford to pay their water bills anymore. That's happening here in America, it's happening in Europe, and it's happening in a lot of other parts of the world. So we have to pay attention to what the cost of the water is. And so some of these other options, so that says, not going to be widely available, for all purposes and in all places. Water importation, I touched on that, fairly expensive, and people are going to have trouble with you reaching into their water accounts and taking some of their water. If you're in this problem, if you're concerned about water scarcity, it's because you've already fully tapped out on your local water supplies. You've dried up your river, you're drying up your local aquifer. So those options aren't available to you. So what are we left with? Where then do we go? Well, I'll argue for the rest of this presentation that we have to go to water conservation. For many, many different reasons, including the fact, and I want to point that out here from this graph, it is by far and away the most cost-effective way of dealing with a water crisis, of a water shortage problem. So I'm going to highlight two big solutions here, give you a little bit of details about both of them, and then wrap it up. The first big solution is that we need to start creating water. Each and every one of us needs to start creating water. We need to start creating water within our homes, within our businesses, and out on our farms. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, what I really mean by that is each gallon that we don't consume leaves that gallon in the water sources, in the water account, and therefore becomes available to other people to use, or becomes available for the support of natural ecosystems, for fish and other aquatic life, for example, to support fisheries that we depend upon. So, in essence, we can think of when we save water, we can think about it as creating water. We're making more water available on the supply side of the account that we can put to various uses. Let me show you just a couple of the really, really smart ways of doing this. Within cities, there was a very interesting bit of research that was done at University of California at Davis a couple of years ago. It was actually done by a master's student. And he decided to compare the water use in cities in the western United States with cities in Australia. And he found came to a rather remarkable conclusion, was that Australian cities on average use half or less of the water being used in western US cities. And so when you look into his report and his findings, here's what you discover. By far the biggest reason is the difference in how much water is being used outdoors in these cities. In most of our western cities, half or more of all the water use is going to outdoor landscape watering. And it goes to create landscapes like the one that you see on the left from Los Angeles. Bright green lawns, verdant vegetation, tropical vegetation. We're creating different worlds, different realities in our landscaped yards by pouring a lot of water on them. By contrast, in Australia, they've become very accustomed to using a lot less water outdoors. They've become accustomed, and they love their native plants, their native flowers, their native shrubs. And they require very little, if any, supplemental water. They don't have to water these plants. Some have referred to this as xeriscaping, but it's basically just landscaping according to what nature provides, to the best extent possible. So by far and away, this was the biggest reason why Australian cities are using a lot less water than cities in the western United States. Interestingly, the one other factor that made a significant difference was the fact that Australians have been using different types of toilets for a long time. You've probably seen these 2-button toilets. They're just becoming more and more popular, being put to greater use here in the United States. But they're 2 buttons, either a full flush or a half flush, and you can figure out which one you're supposed to use depending upon what you've done. But remarkably, this makes a difference. We flush a lot of water down our toilets, and so if you have a mechanism to choose how much water to put down the toilet, it can actually save a good deal of water. Now, there are many, many other ways to save water within our homes and our businesses. Here in the United States, we have the benefit of the fact that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, labels dishwashing machines, clothes washing machines, shower heads, faucets, that sort of thing. They label it with this label that they call WaterSense, and it's something to look for. When you're shopping for new fixtures for your home, new appliances, you can pay attention to this, and you can contribute substantially to using less water within your home by being a little bit more attentive to how water gets used through these various fixtures and appliances. Now I'm going to turn to some solutions on farms because remember, go back to the statistic that I shared with you earlier. More than 90% of the consumptive use taking place, and particularly even greater than that in the water-scarce regions of the world, is going to irrigated agriculture. So we have to be looking at farms and trying to solve this water budget equation. The pictures here are from 2 different places in the world. This isn't to suggest that everybody who grows crops in Arizona is doing it in a wasteful or an inefficient way. There are a lot of farmers that are using the more advanced irrigation techniques that are illustrated here from India. What's shown in the picture from India is what's called drip irrigation. It's rather than spilling a lot of water out into the field, what we call flood irrigation, it's instead using water in a very precise way, using these plastic tubes to deliver the water out to each individual plant, to deliver the water right to the plant roots, and it can end up saving a lot of water. It can actually reduce the consumptive use of water fairly remarkably. There are many, many different ways to be more efficient with irrigation water, and we need to be applying those at grand scales in a much more comprehensive way. Another way that we can think about saving water out on farms is to consider, if you're having water shortage problems, if you're running out of water for your farming activities, we have to think about whether or not we might try to grow something different, something that might use a lot less water. And so here's an illustration just to make this point. So let's say that you were previously growing a lot of alfalfa to feed cattle, to feed beef cattle, and you decided that you wanted to consider the possibility of shifting on that same farmland, going to growing vegetables instead. Quite remarkably, that conversion on the same area of land would use 75% less water, generate 9 times more income for the farmer, and create 23 times more jobs. Now, those are remarkable numbers, and it does suggest that there's a lot of opportunity here. There's tremendous opportunity to get at that large volume of water that's being used for growing our crops. And it may make you wonder then, why aren't a lot of farmers doing this? And there's a lot of reasons why. There are cultural reasons. You may have been growing the same crop that your father grew and that your grandfather grew, and it's what you've become accustomed to, and it's what you love doing. It's like this is your identity as you grow alfalfa, or you grow walnuts, or you grow onions, and that's something that's sort of in your bloodstream, and it's what you know how to do, and it's part of your heritage, and there's a lot of strength to that, and it makes it difficult for you to think about shifting to other practices. You may not have the capital to make the switch. You may not have the financing to be able to do that. To go from one thing to another may require some adjustments, some modifications, some infrastructure investments on the farm that may be very difficult for you to make financially. And so we need to be thinking about, so given that there is this potential to realize so much water savings out on farms, we as a society, we as our national governments, as our state governments, need to be thinking about, how do we incentivize this? We don't want to tell the farmers what to do. because they're going to be resistant and hostile to that kind of a mandate. And more importantly, they're the ones that know better than the rest of us how to save some water out on the piece of land that they've been working on. So we need to find some way to help them make these transitions. And so that gets me to my other big solution. We need to find ways to enable each of us to better share water, and to share water between different groups of users, between farmers and cities and industries, and share water with the environment, share water with nature again. So I'll tell you this very quick story about my home city of San Diego. I grew up in San Diego, was there until I was in my early 20s. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to go visit my parents in San Diego, and on the flight home, I took these pictures from the airplane. It's looking down on Point Loma and San Diego Bay there. And turns out I flew right over, just to the east of San Diego, a large farming district called the Imperial Irrigation District. Extremely important farming area for all Americans. This is where most of your winter vegetables come from in the supermarkets. It's where almost all of our winter lettuce comes from, for example. This is a really, really important area, and the Imperial Irrigation District uses a lot of water. They hold the largest single share of the Colorado River. So the share of California's rights to the Colorado River. They hold nearly half of California's entire entitlement to the Colorado River out in this one farming district. And so the water managers in San Diego came up with a really, really smart solution. San Diego has done a great job on water conservation. San Diego has started to invest in water recycling. San Diego has just built one of the largest desalination plants in the United States. They have been trying a lot of different things to try to rebalance their water budgets, but they're still not secure. They still feel like they need some additional water supply. And so they went after what I think is one of the smartest and most economical ways of improving their overall water security. They worked out a deal with the Imperial Irrigation District. And here's how the deal works. They pay each year now, and a little bit more every year, about $60 million presently each year to the Imperial Irrigation District's farmers. In return, those farmers are investing on their farmlands and putting into place more efficient ways of irrigating, lining their irrigation ditches and canals so not as much evaporates or seeps into the soil where it subsequently evaporates. Finding all kinds of different ways of saving some water using the funding that the city of San Diego is providing. In turn, that water now accounts. That water that's being saved on the farms in the Imperial Irrigation District is providing fully a third of San Diego's entire water supply. There are other examples like this that I could have shared with you, but the really important point I want to make here is that if we find ways to work out deals among ourselves, once a community of water users has realized that they're bumping up against the ceiling of their available water supplies, one of the really important things to do, and after you've invested in creating water and being as efficient and conservative with the water as you can, the next place to turn is figuring out ways to share water with each other. So in any community of water users, there are going to be some water users who don't have enough water to meet their needs. They wish they had more. They'd do anything, including pay for having more. And there's always going to be some water users in the water user community that can afford to use less water. They have a surplus. They have a luxury of water. They have more entitlement than they need. Or they can readily invest, like the Imperial Irrigation District did, in saving some water that could then be traded. In this way, particularly with farmers, I talk about in my book about this creates huge opportunities for farmers in these irrigated agricultural areas, in these places where you have water scarcity problems. It creates the opportunity for farmers to not only grow crops, but also to grow water. And that can be a really important supplement to their incomes. It can make them a lot more financially viable, and it's something that we need to be taking a strong look at everywhere that we have water scarcity problems, and we need to take a hard look at the hurdles and the impediments, the laws and regulations and rules that prevent this kind of activity from happening. Because when it happens, we can all better meet our water needs, we can better share water, and our local economies will benefit from that, and will create a lot more jobs at the same time. So I'll leave you with just one thought. This isn't a comprehensive vision of a water secure future, but it does illustrate the points that I've been making in this presentation. It's just one possibility. So if we can find ways to just use 20% less water in irrigated agriculture, we would be able to transfer or reallocate that water such that our farms can remain productive, our cities can grow as they need to grow, and our rivers, wetlands, and estuaries can be restored back to their health. So I think about that possibility every day, and I commit much of my time in my professional life to that particular objective. I think it's very, very important, and we're looking for all ways to enable that vision. I'm going to close with this slide. It's the last page of my book, Chasing Water, that I wrote a couple of years ago, but it's a really, really nice quote written by a guy living in northern New Mexico, in an agricultural community in northern New Mexico. So he says, "Later that night it began to rain, then to pour, as if the skies were saying that as soon as we all managed to cooperate among ourselves, then one way or the other, there would be enough water for everyone." And I want to leave you with that thought, and thank you very much for your attention today. Okay, I hit my intended mark, which is to not use up more than 2/3 of my time, and now I have the opportunity to take any and all questions. I'll try to tackle anything you want to throw at me.
Oh, this might be a hard one. What's your take on the Flint water condition right now?
On the Flint water condition. Well, the basic outlines of it, and I don't know the details, I'll start with that right away, so I'm going to be careful about how much I'm going to say with my answer. There are many, many people who know much, much more about this, and you can read a lot more about it. But the basic issue was that as a cost-saving measure, the city made the decision, the water providers for the city of Flint made the decision to switch water sources, and going from one source of water to another source of water. As I understand it, what they didn't adequately appreciate was that the chemistry of that new water source was such that it caused a lot of corrosion in the pipes through which the water is being distributed out to all the city residents, and has led to some pretty serious health problems. It's quite a calamity. It's all that I think I really can say about that is, and the criticism that's been wielded against that decision is, these are knowable things. We understand what chemistry will do to lead pipes, to the corrosion of lead pipes. We know what poor quality water of any sort, polluted water, the health effects that it might have. When we make those kinds of decisions, we need to take full accounting of what the trade-offs are, the advantages and the disadvantages, and a really big one was overlooked in that case, unfortunately. Yes?
My first question is on the consumptive loss problem. Mm-hmm. I'm finding things that I'm using, even though I could convert, let's say, my toilet to a two-button system.
Yep.
I'm still running into problems with that stuff failing, and when it fails, it leaks water. I think it should be designed so that when it fails, it does not leak water.
Now, when you're saying it fails, are you referring to the toilet itself?
The toilet, yes.
Okay.
And it leaks water.
Okay.
When it fails.
It's a poorly made toilet.
Of course it is.
It shouldn't do that.
But I cannot find one that when it fails does not leak water.
Ah.
They haven't designed one yet, or at least I haven't found one, regardless of cost. To convert a toilet to a two-button system costs about $30.
Okay.
Which is not a small cost.
No, it's not. What city do you live in?
Fort Myers, Florida.
Okay. I ask because there are a lot of cities. So remember what I said about the reasons why people don't do the right thing, right? Why don't people install new fixtures, more water-efficient water fixtures? Why don't farmers go to more efficient ways of irrigating? It's because of what the question that, or the point that he just made, that cost of that transition can be difficult, can be unaffordable. And so in a lot of cities, particularly cities that are again up against the limits of their water supply, they're trying to incentivize that transition by providing rebates on the cost of installing a new toilet. So in many cities, they'll cover the full cost. I did that in my home. I live in a pretty water-rich place right now. I live in the city of Charlottesville, Virginia. We get 45 inches of rain on average each year. And it's almost every year. We don't vary very much. And it's month to month. It's pretty much the same too. It's a really interesting place. Just a lot of water coming all the time. But back in the early 2000s, and particularly in 2002, we hit the drought of record. We hit a drought that was unlike anything we'd ever had before. And even in that water-rich place, our water budget got out of whack. And our reservoirs started to plummet. And our water managers got really concerned that we were within a couple of months of running out of water. If we hadn't gotten the rains that finally saved us, we would have been in serious trouble even in that fairly wet place. Our city ended up paying for anybody who wanted to replace their toilet with a more water-efficient toilet. They paid for it. They paid for the plumber, they paid for the toilet, they paid for the whole shebang. That's an example of an incentive, and the reason for doing that is that it makes sense financially for the water managers. So instead of having to build a big new reservoir to store more water, they realize that it's much more cost-effective to make investments in improving everybody's ability to use water more efficiently, more conservatively, and so the toilet rebate was one of the ways that they did that. There are many toilets that don't have that problem that you're describing, I can assure you.
I don't know what they are. I wish I did. Because I can see even the system I put in, even though it costs $30, 10, 15 years from now, it's going to fail. And it's going to cost me $300 in water.
Yeah.
And the other problem is they charge me twice as much for the sewer as they do for the water.
Yeah. No, I understand, and I can tell you're very frustrated with that. But I know that there are some sort of lock stock products out there that are quite efficient and quite reliable and do save a lot of water.
The other thing I'm wondering about too is things you use. You're talking about outdoor use, the landscaping and so forth.
Right.
You need to somehow put restrictions on the kind of things that can be bought for that use, such that they don't fail and leak water. For instance, don't sell hoses that will leak if they have water pressure in them and the heat comes along.
Yeah.
They've got to be able to hold the water pressure.
Yep.
I've suffered that problem as well.
Yep. Yeah, there are certainly a lot of inferior products that are being sold, unfortunately, and it's I guess it's let the buyer beware, but I do wish that there was some way of weeding out those products so that people wouldn't have the experiences that you're having. Yes, over here, and then we'll come back over on this side.
Do you think that there's any hope at all of, any hope at all of people abandoning some of the agricultural in the areas which were perhaps not designed to support that type of agriculture with the water supply? I mean, and then you look at the southeast or something where there's enough water, and yet we're, like you say, most of the lettuces, the fresh, winter vegetables, all the rest of it are being shipped across the country to the big population centers rather than trying to accomplish that here.
Yes. A couple thoughts and reactions to it. One is that we're already starting to see that the companies that produce agricultural crops are very well aware of these water risks, and when they start to see their farmers running out of water, they move their operations to different places. So we're already seeing, because of the water shortages in the West, we're already seeing a number of companies moving a lot of their crop production to either the Midwest or the Southeastern United States. There was another part to your question at the beginning that I'm forgetting. I think we all understand, part of the issue of farming and the intergenerational issues with farming, that there are a lot of farmers whose children are not wanting to stay on the farm. They don't want to do that anymore. And there aren't others to come in and take over the operations of that farm. So we do see a good amount of land going out of production. And that's unfortunate in all kinds of different ways. One slight compensation to some of the farmers that are going through that process in the western United States is that if they were irrigation farmers and they hold a water right, then at least they can receive some compensation for making that water available to somebody else. So it's tragic that we're losing that productivity in agriculture, but financially for the family and for even the successors in that family, there at least might be a little bit of a silver lining, literally, to it. There are also places where governments are beginning to incentivize shifts in agricultural production. One of those is in the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia. I talked about that a little bit. Because they were having such bad water shortages, and because they saw so many of the farmers literally going broke, and by the way, there's a lot of tragedy behind that. There was a lot of suicides of farmers in the Murray-Darling Basin during the millennial drought. They saw their entire herds of sheep or cattle, having to be put down, and it was just too much to bear. Very, very sad story. But so the government felt that it needed to step in and create options for these farmers. And so they said, we need to lower the overall consumptive use of water in that river basin by 20%, both so that we can bring our natural ecosystems back to some modicum of health, but just as importantly, or more importantly, we need to enhance the overall water security for the farmers that are going to remain. We don't want them running out of water anymore. In order to do that, we need to get the overall use of water down. So for the farmers that wanted to get out of the business, they sold their water rights, their water entitlements to the government, and the government then gave that back to nature. It's environmental water now. But the government also invested a great deal in helping the farmers that wanted to make the transition to more efficient farming to do that. So they invested quite heavily in their ability to use less water. That's enabled a lot of those farmers to stay on the ground and to remain viable. And I think it's also enticing some of the younger generation who was looking at the bank accounts of their parents and saying, this isn't for me. Now I think some of them are starting to reconsider the possibility of staying in farming, and that's a very good thing. But again, I go back to, in Australia, the dark side of the story is that the government started by saying, you have to use 20% less water. Then they followed up with that and they said, and we're going to help you make that transition by giving you all this money to buy your water rights or to put more efficient irrigation practices on your farm. But the fact that they started with telling them what to do made a lot of farmers mad, and a lot of them remain very, very angry. One last thing I'll say about that is, one of the things that we have to be careful about here is whether we're moving crops to different parts of the country or different parts of the world, whether we're enabling some farmers to get out of the business and to do that with a little bit of financial compensation. One of the things that we have learned in the last 20 years is that you got to be very careful not to take too many farmers out of a community, because then you get all these knock-on effects. You get they're not buying as much seed. They're not buying as much farm equipment. They're not showing up in the local grocery stores. They're not going to the movie theaters. They're not eating dinner out at the restaurants. And those economic linkages can really ripple in a very, very sad way in a community. So, but I think we're getting smarter. I think that we are getting better and better at how you socially engineer through some of the transitions that we're going to need to be made. And two of the secret ingredients are giving enough time for people to make a transition, and then making it financially possible for them to do it. Yes.
Hi, I have 2 questions.
Okay.
One of them is, I don't have the exact, I might not have all the correct information, but I had heard that either the Bush family or some political family was buying up the water rights outside the U.S. because they know where there is going to be water available. And so how can they buy up the water rights in other countries in order to charge us and tax us on it when the water shortages are really implemented?
Okay. There are a lot of misunderstandings about the way that this water trading works, or the way that what we're calling water markets work. So I want to clarify a couple things there. Part of that story is true, and part of it's, I think, not so true. So the part that is true is that there are a number of places in the world where you can purchase water rights from any other part of the world. I can go on the internet right now and buy water rights in the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia. So that is possible. It's only possible in actually one place, in that place that I just mentioned, but it's probably going to become available in a number of other places within the next decade. But the part that needs to be clarified is that the water itself is always retained in ownership by the government. They're not selling the water. What they're selling is the right to use the water. And that's important because if they're starting to have problems with the system, then the government who owns the water can change the rights to use water and try to adapt and try to adjust to some of those problems that come about. Another part of this is that there are no places where you can hoard water. So some of you may have seen, I forget which of the James Bond movies it was, but it was the one about this sort of evil guy somewhere in the world was taking ownership and controlling a lot of water that was being stored underground and making it impossible for the local village to have a water supply. In reality, it's highly unlikely that that could happen because for the most part, there aren't any places where you can just buy water and hold on to it and not use it or store it somewhere. It always has to be, number one, the way that you're using the water has to be approved. Again, remember, the government owns the water. They manage the rights to how you're going to use the water. If you're doing something wrong, they can do something about that. So holding on to the water and preventing others from using it, even if the Bush family or anybody else, myself, if I was to buy water, that water is still going to have to get used by somebody for a purpose approved by the government. So now, there's a lot of things that can go wrong with these systems. Let me be very clear about that. This is no silver bullet, even though I've highlighted it as a big solution, this water sharing and water trading. Some of these market systems, when they got set up, there were some of the sectors of society that didn't understand the rules around what they needed to do to file an application to get a water right in the first place. They didn't have the ability to read. They didn't have the ability to drive to the place where you had to make these filings. You know, there were all kinds of reasons why certain sectors of society got cut out of that system. We can't let that kind of thing happen. Everybody needs to have access to water, particularly for their basic human needs. But everybody should be provided with the opportunity to participate in systems like this if they care to. The other part of these systems is that when you're allocating the water for use, you have to go back and answer that question I posed at the beginning of my presentation. How much water do we want to leave alone? We don't want to give away, we don't want to issue permits for all of the water, and yet, as I also showed you in a subsequent slide, but in fact that's what we've done. California has allocated somewhere between 5 and 8 times more water rights than the water that's available within the river systems. You could say this about a lot of other places as well. So we got to be careful to make sure that everybody has access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water, and we also need to take care of our natural systems. And then the water that's left, then we can make decisions about how we want to make that available, who gets to, who has access to that, what are the consequences for that.
Something else that just occurred to me, I was told that in New York, I live in New York, you're not allowed to collect rainwater, like you're not allowed to save water now, and they can, arrest you or for saving water.
Yeah, that's actually been true in a couple of the western states. Those states are pretty much all moving toward correcting that problem, though. It is true, just a few years ago in the state of Colorado, if you were to build a big cistern out in your backyard and you took all of your roof runoff water and routed it to the cistern, that was an illegal act. But they are fixing that now because they saw how ridiculous this is. This is something that actually can help homeowners use less water from the potable drinking water supply. They can put it out on their gardens, out on their landscaping, use it to flush their toilets, what have you, and that's a good thing. And so states are coming to their senses on that one, thankfully. Yes.
Hi, I live in California, and actually all the water that falls on the land belongs to the state.
Yes.
Still.
Yes.
And they're trying to sort out how that is because a lot of people have built ponds and lakes, and a lot of them are illegal because they just did it and they didn't get permits because they did it years ago. So they're trying to sort that out. But what I wanted to talk about is I'm a filmmaker. I've filmed farmers who have saved the amount of water they use because they've improved their soil.
Yes.
They use compost and
Yes.
they use cover crops, which they fold back in the soil.
Yes.
And they use mulch.
Yes.
And they use varieties of plants that the roots reach down into the soil and
Yes.
pull the water up that's
Yes.
in the soil, the little pockets in the soil, instead of being addicted to irrigation where the
Yes.
roots are right up next to where the water comes out. So it's just in a little ball there. So it becomes dependent on irrigation. And I wonder if that they've saved, there's farmers in the Napa Valley, I'm going to show a film tomorrow about that when they switch over to the kind of varieties that go down deep into the soil, they can dry farm grapes like everybody used to, instead of the new varieties, which are where they're clumped around where the irrigated water comes out. So there's
Yes.
not as much flavor and that sort of thing because they're not pulling it up from the soil.
Yes.
So I wonder if you could talk about that because it
Yes.
seems like one of the things, and they're doing that in California now. They are using mulch and cover crops and compost. Even the traditional farmers are doing that because it actually improves the soil. Because if the soil is really dried out, the water will just rush off.
That's
and
right.
that's why these 100-year floods that happen in Iowa, there is more rainfall, but also the soil has become so degraded
Yes.
and so compacted that the water can't get in.
And the plants can't use
And
it.
the plants can't get it, so
Yeah.
it just rushes off. And so the plants are basically suffering a drought, but above, on the top, it's a huge flood. So I
Yes.
wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, first, thank you very much for raising that issue, and you are absolutely right, and thank you also for trying to publicize it through your own work. The practice of improving soil quality is a really, really important thing when we're talking about water conservation, using less water out on the farm. The more the soil can absorb water and retain the water and make it available to the plants, the less water that you have to keep applying onto the plant. One of the things that I did in the last year with my University of Virginia students is, again, because I'm so focused on this challenge of how do we use less water in irrigated agriculture, there's been a lot of critiques emerging in the last decade from other members of the scientific community who are seeing a lot of false claims about the potential water savings of various practices. And so they've been so vehement in their criticisms that it's leading some people to think, oh, maybe we can't really save any water at all. And so to try to counterbalance that, I pulled together a group of graduate students and we did some very, very careful research. And we looked at really credible, well-documented, properly conducted field trials of farm plots, and using all kinds of different methods, changing the types of sprinklers, soil, increasing the organic matter within the soils, drip irrigation. We looked across all of these. We did a fairly comprehensive global survey and pulled together the studies that we thought were legitimate and defensible and credible. And we're publishing a paper on that. And if anybody's interested in seeing those results, just give me a card or an email address. I'll be glad to share that with you as soon as we're ready to share it. But thank you for bringing that one up. I should include that one in some of my illustration slides. So thank you. It's a really important one.
I just had a quick question.
Yes.
When you're watching the news and you see all the floods that are occurring in different places, and it's just raining and raining and raining, I was sitting and thinking, is there no way that you could send tankers in and drain that water out and transport it somewhere that there, you know, people are having droughts. I don't know. I was just thinking, you know, it should be a way to move it to a profitable place.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It makes total sense. So let me give you a little bit of a two-part answer to it. One is that flooding at natural levels, you know, ways that humans haven't had caused a lot of changes to the floods, can actually be very important to the health of, say, a river ecosystem. Those floods do a lot of work of moving sediments around, transporting organic material from upstream to downstream, creating a lot of conditions, a lot of habitat conditions that are really important for the overall health of the ecosystem. And so that variation in water from day to day, month to month, year to year, actually, as we've learned over the last couple of decades, is pretty important in shaping which creatures can live there, the quality of the habitat, the overall health of the system, the productivity of the system. So I wanted to just set that as a foundation, and then to say that two things. There is always some portion of that flood water that can be shaved and taken and stored and used for human purposes without doing environmental damage. There are also many places where we have caused the floods to be worse. We've paved over vast areas in cities. We've changed the agricultural landscapes. And so a lot more water, the same amount of rain generates bigger floods now in many, many parts of the world. And so arguably, those bigger floods are actually doing damage to the natural systems. They're just too big, coming too frequently. And we could help that situation out by pulling out some of that water, shaving some of that flood water off, storing it either above the surface or finding ways to get it to infiltrate into the ground and be stored underground, and utilize it for our benefit. It's very possible, it's very sensible, and more, particularly in cities, we're seeing that being used. In other words, a lot of them call it stormwater management. So many cities are now thinking about capturing some of that excessive stormwater and then putting it into their water supply system. Now they have to treat it, of course, and do those things to it.
Oh,
but
okay. So that's not far-fetched.
Not at all far-fetched. In fact, something we need to be doing a lot more of.
Okay. And then
good idea. Thank you.
The other thing is that the bottled water that we're drinking every day, how is that regulated? How is that affecting our water supply? Is it regulated? Where are they getting the water from? First of all.
Good questions. Sure. I don't know anything about the tax thing. I honestly don't. There have been many books written about bottled water and some of the problems associated with bottled water, and I encourage you to read them. My friend Peter Glick, G-L-E-I-C-K, wrote one of the best, one of the most credible, one of the most objective books on that topic. I'm going to try and give you a little bit of a balanced answer to this, because there are legitimate arguments on multiple sides of this question. The first is that where does the water come from? Much of the bottled water originally came from natural spring systems. So these were groundwater aquifers that were under some natural pressure, and they were releasing their water at the surface and creating natural groundwater springs. And these, so a lot of them, when they say artesian water, for example. The definition of artesian is that the underground water is under enough pressure because of all the overlying soil and rock that's on top of it. So it's really kind of, it's like a sponge being squeezed. And it's squeezing it enough that if you stick a well down into it, the water rises all the way up and flows at the ground surface. That's what an artesian well is. So when you see artesian spring water, it's water that came from an underground aquifer that was under pressure, like that, okay? So a lot of the bottled water initially it was artesian spring water, and that was part of the marketing, is artesian sounds very magical, right? More recently, much of the bottled water is just coming out of municipal water supply systems, and much of it without any additional treatment. So they're just taking water out of their own tap and putting it in a bottle and delivering it to you. And they call that purified water. Now, some of the companies do some additional treatment to the water, so they get it to be of different, better quality, presumably, than it would have been in your municipal tap. But there's no mystery to a lot of it. You know, it's just the public water supply system. There have been a lot of arguments. So there's also, I want to just touch on that, there's also a very, very legitimate concern about the plastic. You raised that, the issue about the plastic. The plastic is a really, really serious problem. Some of the bottled water manufacturers are trying now to use plastic that has largely plant-based material and decomposes more readily and doesn't remain in the environment for long times. It doesn't end up collecting out in the ocean and on the beaches and all that sort of thing. But plastic is a really, really serious problem, and I'm not going to make any excuses for anybody about that. The argument about the cost of water, of bottled water, is not one that really makes a big alarm for me. We make choices about the things that we buy and that we consume. And the fact that somebody's taking municipal water and sticking it in a bottle and selling it to you, it's like, well, people sell us a lot of things, and arguably they maybe should not be making as much profit by doing that, but they have a right to the water. They're not doing anything illegal. They're making some profit from it. And then what they would counter with the bottled water companies, I've spoken to a lot of them and I've spoken to them a lot, is that they would say that they are giving you an option. Whereas you used to be somewhere away from home or at school and you used to go to the soft drink dispenser and get a can of Coca-Cola or something else, they're giving you a new option, and they think that that's a healthy option to be providing you. They're making it convenient for you to make a different choice. Something that's not as good for you for something that's good for you. So you can see that this is kind of a really complicated issue to deal with, and I think these are all concerns, but as I said, there are certain parts of it that are definitely problems. The one last one I'll circle back to is, for the water that's being taken directly out of the natural environment, out of the spring water and that sort of thing, there are a number of places where they have taken too much out, and we go back to my water budget shtick. If they're taking more water out than is being naturally replenished, then they're causing a problem. They're going to dry up that groundwater system, and it's not going to be available for other users in the future. So there are some real legitimate concerns, but I just wanted to try to give you a couple of other, try to represent some of the other issues and considerations at the same time. I think we're all done. I can't take any more questions, but I am going to be available for about a half an hour more. If anybody wants me to sign a book, I'd be happy to do that. Or if you just have questions out in the back, I'd be happy to do that too. But then I've got a flight home this evening, so thank you all.